Despite being only a teenager, Tiffany had one of the biggest songs and biggest albums of the late 80s. She seemed poised to become the next big superstar, but then it all kind of fell apart. So, what happened? This is Tiffany's story. If you end up enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like. And if you want to learn more music history alongside me, that's kind of the point of this channel, then consider subscribing. I'm kind of trying to learn as much as I can about a whole bunch of different genres of music. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, subscribing's free to do, and you can always unsubscribe if you end up not really feeling it. And if you want to play a bigger role in what I'm learning about, I do have memberships open. So I'll be posting polls and just asking questions and trying to get a sense of what members want me to cover next. So it's the best way to do that. It's a couple bucks a month. Probably still not worth it, but if it is, it's there for you. Link in the description below. Tiffany Darwish was born in a city called Norwalk, which is on the outskirts of LA in 1971. Her parents divorced when she was still a baby, and she lived with her mom at Janie Williams. She talked about how her early life was pretty chaotic and challenging because several members of her family, including her mom, struggled with alcoholism. 5 years later, Tiffany's mom, Janie, married a guy named Dan, and that's when both like the highs and lows of their family life really got started. Dan came from a military background and was the son of a minister, so he was pretty strict, which rubbed Tiffany the wrong way, and Tiffany, when she got in trouble, would just like sing alone in her room. So one day, Dan asked if that's what she wanted to do. She was already in dance classes and she loved the idea of performing. So Dan brought up the idea of her one day being a singer professionally, which is something Tiffany never thought about. So she gives Dan a lot of credit for igniting that dream within her. That stepfather, Dan, who worked at a dog food plant, was a massive fan of country music, so it shouldn't really be a surprise that the first song Tiffany remembers singing was Delta Dawn by Tanya Tucker. She got away from her mother in a supermarket, and then her mom found her a little bit later performing Delta Dawn for like a group of older women who were just watching her and amazed by this little 4-year-old. The first time she ever performed for a crowd in a more serious way that weren't just random people in a supermarket was when she was 9 years old, and she performed with a country group outside of a bar in her hometown. There was this country western band that would play standing in a flatbed truck outside of this bar, and somehow Dan convinced them to let his 9-year-old stepdaughter perform with them. They didn't trust her enough to let her up into the flatbed with them, so she would sing like down on the ground. Dan remembered, quote, "But she sang the song so good, they brought her up on the flatbed, and she sang 3-4 songs, and they took up a collection, $235. We used it to buy an outfit for her the next year." Tiffany tells a slightly different version of that story. She said that they passed a hat around and collected $300, which was what clued Dan into the idea that there could be a monetary reason to encourage Tiffany's career. Tiffany said, quote, "I think it changed someone's point of view. It opened somebody's eyes. This wasn't just for fun anymore. This could pay my stepfather's rent." It's pretty clear, and Dan admits this as well, that he's the one who really pushed and encouraged her to try and start a music career. He hired her first manager, Terry Jansen, who worked at a country radio station in San Diego. Terry got started right away, and he booked her on this pretty short tour in some Alaska cities before sending her to Texas, where she got to open for George Jones and Jerry Lee Lewis. She even went to Nashville for the first time as she was trying to become a country singer, so it made sense to go see the motherland of country music. She said, quote, "I started coming here when I was 10. I came here with Hoyt Axton and Mae Axton doing country music at the time. I wanted to be a country singer, and they brought me here. I did a lot of the shows, like the Ralph Emery Show and on and on." But things were slowly starting to unravel in her personal life. Her mother was struggling with alcoholism and would sometimes miss shows or miss rehearsals or just not be there. And Tiffany refused to perform without her mother there, something about not feeling like her stepfather could do her hair the right way or something like that. Also, her marriage with Dan was falling apart. They would divorce in 1984, and Janie spent some time in a psychiatric hospital after a attempt. Tiffany kind of blames herself, or at least she did at the time. I think she's been able to work through a lot of that now, according to some recent videos she posted on her YouTube channel, which are great. You should check those out. But she said at the time she saw how much attention and effort and focus Dan was putting into her musical career and how little time that left him for her mom and her siblings. And she thinks that that contributed to the breakdown of their relationship. Either way, her family was becoming too unreliable, so Terry, her manager, dropped Tiffany. But Dan was able to find her a new manager, a guy named Ron Surratt, who quickly started paying for everything. Dan estimates that Ron put something like $500,000 into Tiffany's career, paying for mortgage payments, vocal lessons, outfits, travel expenses, recording costs, like essentially everything. And no one bothered to question where Ron got his money from. Turns out he had previously been convicted of writing bad checks due to a gambling addiction, so he had some federal charges against him in terms of financial things, so probably not the person you want in charge of your teenager's career. With her parents going through a divorce and her mother's battle with alcoholism, Tiffany said that she would cry a lot before she went to perform. She said she learned to internalize the sadness, and she just had a cloud of sadness around her all the time, even as like a 12-year-old. She said, quote, "I started singing. I loved singing, but I don't know that I was having fun." Eventually, she got the attention of a guy named George Tobin, who would kind of change her life. She dropped Ron as a manager and signed with George. George said about meeting her, quote, "I met her when she was 12. She came into my office and sang country songs. She was amazing. All she needed was seasoning." One of her first big national breaks was appearing on a show called Star Search that was hosted by Ed McMahon. She was going by the name Tiffany Renee at that time, and even though she placed second, she said that she learned a ton, specifically by watching the performer that beat her. She learned how to be more than just a voice. She needed to have kind of a more expansive performance package. She said, quote, "I couldn't just use my voice. I had to be a performer. I think my competitor had that in the bag. She was great at acknowledging the audience and really performing, so I grew after that." She also moved beyond country music and started singing pop after hearing Stevie Nicks on the radio and just being blown away by her. And we've all had that experience of just being blown away by Stevie Nicks, I'm sure. George Tobin was everything that Ron was not in a manager. He was really well connected in the music industry. He knew people, he knew how to find the right songs, so he was able to advance her career in really serious ways that her previous managers were not able to do. He was also pretty egotistical and really controlling, depending on who you ask. So, with Tiffany being 14 and 15 at the time, and her parents' lives being in a state of disarray, it became a power struggle between George and Janie and Dan for control of Tiffany's career. And I think George makes no secret of the fact that he saw dollar signs when he looked at Tiffany. He saw a way to make money and he wanted to make money. He doesn't really apologize for that. He's a businessman. That's what he's supposed to do. In the midst of that tension, at least at first, Tiffany sided with George because she said she looked around at the adults in her life not really making the best decisions, so she didn't trust them to make decisions for her career, whereas George at least appeared to have it all together and was promising to give her a little bit more freedom and more control over her career, even if that didn't necessarily pan out. Janie testified in court about George, saying, quote, "She relies completely on his advice and direction. Whenever she even begins to question him, he advises her that her success is due to him, and if she does not cooperate, he will sell her contract to the highest bidder. This threat leaves her in tears." In 1987, George was able to get her a contract with MCA, and at the same time signed a new contract as her manager that gave him almost complete control over everything. Together, they started working on her debut album, and George controlled most of what that album sounded like. Tiffany said, quote, "Tiffany is the voice. The songs are George Tobin, and the arrangements are George Tobin. All the production values are George Tobin." When it came time to name the album and essentially herself, Tiffany struggled between taking her stepfather's name, Dan, so she would be Tiffany Williams, or taking her birth father's name, so Tiffany Darwish. She said she was really close to her birth father, so it would feel kind of insulting to not use that name. But also, Dan was the one who was primarily responsible for encouraging and forwarding her early musical career. So it seemed like she kind of owed it to him to be Tiffany Williams. At the end, she just decided, I'm just going to be Tiffany. Leave it at that. The album, just called Tiffany, was released in 1987 and was a bit of a slow burn. They worked on it for 10 months with Tiffany commuting between Norwalk and Los Angeles, and Tiffany said that she loved the recording process. She loved being in a vocal booth. One, because she loved singing and she loved seeing how it all worked behind the scenes, but also because it was a place where no one could disturb her. She's in a vocal booth. They want her to get a good track, so they're just going to leave her in there. They're not going to like go interrupt. So it's a place where she could be by herself. And she said in between takes, she would work on her own songwriting or writing poetry or journaling or something like that. So it's just a really good time for her to kind of like mentally decompress and do what she loved doing. The first single, Danny, failed to chart, and MCA realized that they didn't really know how to promote her. She was a teenager, and how could they prove to radio stations that she had a wider appeal? They started by sending her on a tour of high schools to appeal to that teenage market. That didn't really work out as well as they wanted, so they sent her out on a national tour with the Jets, who were a pretty popular teen pop band at that point. but that also didn't move the record all that much. And that's when Larry Salters, the senior vice president at MCA, came up with an idea. He suggested sending her on a nationwide tour of shopping malls. She would perform several sets a day, singing over a pre recorded track at these malls, and then sell her record and do like meet and greets and signings and stuff with people who saw her perform. By the end of the day, every mall she played, her record would be basically sold out. But as much as the gimmick worked to push the record, it also hurt her image a bit. The idea of her being a teenager singing in malls kind of became her image, for better or worse. One newspaper from Wisconsin in 1987 talked to a couple of teenagers who saw her perform at the mall, and they said they felt embarrassed for her. One of them said, quote, "She's got a good voice. I don't know why she goes around giving concerts at shopping malls. If she's serious, she ought to give concerts in normal places." I think this image of her performing in shopping malls is kind of the enduring image of her career. I think that's what most people think of when they hear Tiffany. They think this teen pop star who performed in food courts. Like, it's just an inherently unserious image. And I think that's a shame because, like they were saying, she had a good voice. She was a good performer, but just the idea of performing in malls kind of doesn't give the best impression, I don't think. But it worked, and radio stations started to pay attention to Tiffany because her records were selling at these mall shows. Her second single, a cover of a song by Tommy Jones and the Shandells, became a massive hit. I Think We're Alone Now hit #1 and is one of the defining songs of the late 80s. But at first, Tiffany hated the idea of recording it because it sounded dated. It wasn't cool and modern, but George created a new mix for it, making it more dancey, and when Tiffany played that version for her friends, they all really liked it. She said, "After a while, when I started to have to sing it for performances, I thought, yeah, it's pretty good. It's kind of fun and it has a good beat. My friends liked it, so I was wrong." Off the success of her mall tour and that super popular single, her album hit #1, which made her the youngest female performer to ever have a #1 album, and it went 4 times platinum. So I think all of the marketing tactics worked, even if it kind of cast a weird shadow over her image and legacy. In 1988, coming off of that success, Tiffany embarked on a legal battle that would shape the next portion of her career and probably the rest of her life, if we're being honest. She tried to declare herself an emancipated adult and break free from her mother's control of her life and her career, citing her mother's past issues with alcoholism, which at that point, Janie was sober and had been for several years. For her part, Janie thought that this was instigated by George, that he was the one convincing Tiffany to do this because George wanted more control over her life and her career. She even hinted at the fact that George wasn't being honest in the financials. She claimed that George wasn't giving Tiffany the money she was owed for her hit album and her hit record and her shows, even though, based on the terms of their contract, George got 50% of all of her royalties and he got 20% of like performance fees and merch sales and all of this stuff, which is far more than people in George's position typically get. George denied in any way being a part of Tiffany's decision to pursue this legal action, even though Tiffany used his lawyers. I'm not going to comment on their personal relationship. I don't know. No one really knows other than them. I don't know if he was kind of instigating this. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Who knows? But I will say that his contract was pretty intense for the time. The Washington Post reported back then that George's contract, quote, gives him exclusive rights to manage her career until she is 23. He has the last word on what she sings and where, what she wears, and whom she speaks with, if anyone, in the press. Even her official biography is subject to his approval. That same article also noted that there was no third party auditing the money that George paid to Tiffany. The label would pay George the royalties as her manager, and then he would give Tiffany her share of it with no business manager or objective third party making sure that all of that was above board and George was paying the proper amounts. So it seems like her mother was pretty nervous about that contract, especially as she learned more about how it actually worked and how other manager contracts in the industry worked, which, for the record, managers typically get about 10%. It varies, but 10% is very common. So for him to get double that as well as 50% of all royalties is kind of strange. George argues that he put way more effort into her career than typical managers did, so he was entitled to it. Whatever, you can form your own opinions about that. I think he was taking too much, but you can form your own opinions about that. But it sounds like Tiffany wanted to be emancipated so she could sign her own contracts without parental approval, and that feels like that might have been influenced by George, who would want her to sign this contract that was very beneficial to him. But talking about this contract, which certain people have called exploitative, George said, quote, "This agreement was reviewed by the juvenile courts of Los Angeles. They review any and all contracts regarding minor actors and recording artists. Everything was approved." He added, "Janie hired lawyers and a forensic accountant to see if I had cheated or misappropriated any monies due. Their team scoured through millions in revenue and couldn't find $1 unaccounted for or missing. Had they found something, the contract could have been broken immediately. She continued under the agreement. So what does that tell you?" But her mother said in court, quote, "I believe the emancipation proceedings to be a disguised attempt for Mr. Tobin to obtain de facto custody of Tiffany without proving that parental custody would be detrimental to her." The judge ultimately denied Tiffany's petition, but he did allow her to move out of her mother's home, and her grandparent became her legal guardian, at least for a little while. While all of this was going on, Tiffany was deep at work with her second album called Hold an Old Friend's Hand that was released in November of 1988. It didn't do nearly as well as the first, but one song did hit the charts, peaking at number 17. Tiffany says now that a lot of the songs on the second album were just straight up ripoffs. She didn't write the songs, but she said she watched the songwriters, which she commented were really good songwriters, be forced to recreate and rework popular songs. And then she commented on how frustrating that would be whenever she would like go to these awards shows and see the people whose songs she ripped off and have to interact with them. And it was just really awkward. And she, without saying it directly, she kind of implied that that was George's call. George was the one kind of forcing these talented songwriters to do that. She was also dealing with the added pressure of people seeing her not as a genuine artist with a unique voice, but just a one-hit wonder who was the product of a producer. So when the album was just songs that sounded like other people, that was pretty hard for her to take. I'm just going to take a side note here to rant about something. I've done videos in the past and a couple recently with bands or artists that could be considered one-hit wonders, and every time I do one of these videos, the comments are just full of people very offended that I called them a one-hit wonder, and I never understand why that's the case. Because to me, a one-hit wonder is just saying you had one hit. It shouldn't be a negative connotation. If anything, it's saying you did something that 99% of other musicians could not do. You had a massive, massive song, and that's really cool. And that's something I don't have. That's something probably everyone watching this video doesn't have. So like, why is that a bad thing? In my head, it's not saying that they aren't influential. That's not saying they don't have other great songs. I think most of my favorite artists don't have hits, so they can't even be called one-hit wonders. Some of the artists that I think are the most influential of all time never had a hit. So saying you're a one-hit wonder doesn't mean you only have one good song. It doesn't mean nothing else you did matters. It just means you had one song that became massive. And I think that's impressive more than it is negative, but it's got such a negative connotation to it, so I don't get that. Feel free to argue about it in the comments. Anyway, Tiffany was heavily influenced by serious, real artists. Like, she commented on how she opened up for George Jones and Jerry Lee Lewis and Stevie Nicks. She didn't open for Stevie Nicks, but inspired by Stevie Nicks. So that second album was a massive letdown for her. She didn't feel like she got to be a genuine artist expressing herself. But she still struggled with the idea that she should be grateful that she had the chance to record another one at all. She's here living her dream as a 17-year-old. After that album, and after she turned 18, she left George's management and signed with the people who managed New Kids on the Block. The album she did with them in 1990, called New Inside, completely failed to chart. Tiffany said she wanted to change direction with this album and go a more R&B style, which was how the musical landscape was shifting at that point, but George didn't want to do that. She said at the time in an interview, quote, "My first and second albums, it kind of all sounds the same. I want to let everyone know that the third album is a big change." But that change didn't last all that long, and she was back with George as a producer for her album in 1993 called Dreams Never Die. Originally, that album was only released in Asia, where she still had a pretty big following. Her ballads were really big over there. A planned release in the US never materialized, and Tiffany left MCA after that album. Her relationship with George took another hit when she found out that the songs that he gave her for that album he'd previously given to another band that he was working with, which George didn't think was all that big of a deal. He said it happened all the time when you were trying to find the right songs for the right artist. He said, quote, "The fact is, Tiffany was asked by a reporter if she realized her song had been recorded by another group already, and she was caught off guard. All she had to say was, yes, but now it's mine. I don't know what the deal was, but if you think she wasn't aware she was singing songs already released by an act that I had previously produced, that's bull, and you can quote me on it." He then went on to blame her fans for not supporting her enough. It's a wild ride of an essay that he wrote, essentially saying that he did nothing wrong. He was instrumental to her career. She owes everything to him. There's nothing he can be criticized for. He did everything perfectly with Tiffany's best interest at heart. No one could be mad at him about anything. That's kind of the general tone of that like open letter he wrote to Tiffany's fans in the early 2000s. I'll link that in the description below in case you wanted to read that. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, so give me your own impression on it. With popular music shifting more towards rock and hip hop in the mid to late 90s, I mean, think of bands like Nirvana and Weezer and all of those people getting massive, Tiffany was kind of forgotten about. She fell into that 80s pop sound and couldn't find a way to stay relevant. She moved to Nashville and focused on her career as a songwriter while also trying to make country music again. She did return to Los Angeles to record another pop album, The Color of Silence, in 2002, which was generally considered her best album since her debut. Critics really loved it and thought it was super surprising how good it was. She continued to hang around the legacy pop star circuit, releasing albums that haven't hit the same heights as her earlier work, and appearing in several reality shows like cooking shows and fitness shows, and even like Wife Swap at one point. Today, she lives in a rural area outside of Nashville and is focusing on country music once again. She said she loves the more relaxed pace of everything. Since she is still touring, it's nice to come off the road and spend time with her community and her family that sometimes doesn't even know she can sing. So that's the story of Tiffany, someone who had a super popular song and then it all kind of faded away pretty fast. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know if you have ever seen Tiffany, if you enjoyed any of her music. That's some of my favorite comments to read, is just hearing people's personal story with these artists that I cover. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe so you can learn more about music history with me.